anyway.
As for most of the binaries, I would suspect that up in the 75 to 90% were binary images. Back in the day when the internet first started up, even before that, when you had your UUCP, you had, I think it was alt.sex.binaries. You had all sorts of things like that. You had game binaries. You had...
You think 70% were sex images?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I would imagine so. We had a case here where, I won't go into too many details on it. We had a user that got his account one day, hit his hard limit in one day. And we're just like, okay, there's a problem here. We went through and pulled up his account, and at the time, Mike Mayberry was running Icarus, and he had turned on the logging on FTP, and we looked at where this guy was FTPing all of this stuff, and, well, let's just put it this way. Someone was forced to resign because they were using a government site as a FTP server, and the images that were on it were, well, extremely questionable in nature. So we had a lot of that happen. When we were down there, we were watching disk space just for that reason, because of when we got hooked up on the internet, it was just a flood. I mean, they talk about the problems they have today, and it wasn't. It's not near as bad as it used to be.
And it was all. It wasn't for profit. Any of this stuff.
Oh no, none of it was. There wasn't for profit sites out there at that time. It was just somebody scanning a bunch of pictures and sticking out there on the internet, or sticking out in UCP News. Fact is, a lot of campuses had to take and restrict UCP groups because of the type of materials that were in it. Though there was good stuff out there too. I mean, a lot of people would look at like the alt.sex group, and they'd be, "Oh, you can't look at that. That's dirty." But the fact is, a lot of it was education. People talking about problems they had, and a lot of the UCP stuff was like that. You just had so many groups out there, it was ridiculous. There was, even at that time, I would say there was over 30,000 different groups. In fact, I'm sure there was over that. But yeah, news was one of the big ones, because you had groups out there with, well, today Usenet News is still around. And you've got groups out there just specifically to talk about Java. You've got groups out there just specifically to talk about C. Groups out there specifically to talk about C#. You had a group out there, which if I remember right was .hack, something .hack. And the permissions on the group were set up such that you couldn't post to it. And there were still people posting to it, but what they were doing was hacking around the system to actually get their posts in. And the fact is, there was a newsletter that would come out in the group saying, if you want to post on this, figure out how to. If you're not good enough to hack this group, you're not good enough to be in our discussion group.
That's good.
But there was just a lot of, back in the day when Usenet News came out, it was the only way to do things. And it's kind of sad the way the world's gone now, because that's not a free service anymore on most places. And it would be real nice if that was one of the free services. Most places you go to now on the internet that you want to connect up to Usenet News, you've got to pay a fee. And there's still just a ton of information out there. There was the ability to, if you were having a programming problem trying to figure out how to do something, you could go out there and post, and you get 30, 40 people coming back saying, hey, this is the way you do it. Of course, you also got people coming back going RTFM. And the whole you've heard the term being flamed. That comes from Usenet News. Because somebody makes some stupid posting, and you get 30, 40 people coming back just flaming them for it. The old thing of typing in capitals is screaming. That's where it came from, was all the news feeds. In fact, the easy way to get flamed was put your whole post in capitals. You'd be flamed for shouting. But yeah, it did a lot of changing getting the internet hooked up. Just looking at it today, though, it's grown so great, and like we were saying before, address space is really, really getting hard. Most people anymore are subclassing some of the Class C's and Class B's and doing firewalling, not to protect themselves, but using NAT so they can have 20 systems behind here and have one address on the outside. We're severely running out of space, and IP6, though it has come out, has not picking up and taken off, because you've got the IP4, I guess you want to call it, the old stuff, that they can't get a hold of the IP6 addresses, and nobody's really come out with a good gateway system for it. But eventually we are going to have to go to the IP6, and unfortunately the way they set it up, we're still going to run out of space. We need to have a truly growable address scheme where, like with our IP4, where 1 through 127 is Class A, and so on, so they're going to have to eventually get to the point where 1 through 127 is this size, 128 through whatever is a couple more bytes, and expand it that way. There was talk about it for a while, but then they came out with the IP6 standard, which gives you 256 times, or 256 to the 6th power worth of addresses, and half part of those addresses are gone for broadcast or network addresses.
Up here, as soon as a couple of us did figure out the internet, when I say up here, I mean
Upstairs.
the two centers of initiative in terms of computing, Weber State, were computing services to some extent, and I think it was really the lab rats. I wouldn't say the whole computer science department. I think it was a bunch of agitators, who were aware and who were pushing us forward, with some support from Dr. Bob, because he was
he's an honorary lab rat.
Yeah, spiritually he was their spiritual mentor, and he had an understanding of the way things were. But when a few of us caught on here, there's just a wealth of information about to help us then rapidly advance both our internet connection and just generally networking around on campus. The first version of campus, of a campus PC network in the sense of a suite of services and an interface that would present those to people gracefully, was just substantially built on stuff I grabbed off the internet. The drivers that allowed both a PC to run both TCP and IPX were pulled down from the internet, and I pulled them down from somewhere, and I went somewhere else to grab a document that talked about how to configure them and what the principles were, and I got on a listserv, which was just amazing, and
Oh yeah.
all of a sudden I'm getting 40 messages a day about, from all over the world, literally, and that, in those days, that was just awesome.
When did they set up the first web page here on campus?
I would guess about 1996.
That sounds about right. That's about the time we were setting up our web pages downstairs.
Mm-hmm.
You know what server that was running on? Was that running on the VAX or?
No, I don't think so. I think it was done under Alan Livingston's purview, and he was at that time the director or manager of the department called CATS over in the bottom of the library there, instructional technology, and they favored Windows, maybe Macintosh even. I'm not sure.
Probably Windows.
Now you were building web pages downstairs.
Oh yeah, we had on the Unix boxes we were running Apache and doing a lot of web page building around that time, trying to figure out how the system worked, trying to figure out HTML. Now, of course, was your HTML 1.0 before they came out with all the newer tweaks and whistles. And then, of course, there was always the problem of Microsoft with their specific versions of things that they would put in their pages. It was difficult because there was not a lot of standards. Even today, you'll see web pages out there which run perfectly fine under Internet Explorer, but under some of the new ones, Firefox, etc., they don't run. And then there's others that won't run under Internet Explorer, will run under the others. So we're getting a lot better on it, but there still is a lot of changes in the language between different ones. Take a look at Java, for instance. C# had to be created because Microsoft started doing their own thing with Java and saw how to fit. There's always going to be that until we can get some good standards set up. And in the early days, the only standards we had were what we called RFCs. The fact is, when we started doing the internet, I ended up pulling quite a few of them and bringing them up here saying, hey guys, this is how this says to do it. This is the book of God. Because at the time, RFCs were. They still are in a lot of cases.
But that's a very low technical level, but then most people don't deal with, essentially, the RFC process.
True, it is. RFCs can be low on the level of programming when you're programming low-level stuff, but they also give you your higher-level interfaces. And most people don't need to know exactly what's legal in an email address or how an email message is made, but if you're making your own client, the RFCs were the way to go. When we were looking at how the internet should be set up here, how you break down your addresses, RFCs were the only way to make sure that everybody was on the same page. So they do have their uses.
Did you add to the RFCs?
No, I had never added to the RFCs. Most things, the only thing I've really added to out in the internet world is a couple of flavors of BSD, finding bugs in source code and patching it. In fact, my name's probably in 2 or 3 older versions of FreeBSD. But back to like the campus and that, like I said, when we first started out, nobody was really sure of what we were doing. We did the best we could.
What browser was it? Gopher still, or Mozilla?
Mozilla was one of the major ones that we used downstairs.
Mosaic or Mozilla?
Mosaic.
Yeah, Mosaic.
Mosaic.
Yeah. Wasn't that from NCSA? In other words, wasn't it? It was.
Yeah, I think
it
so.
was a free.
Yeah. Yeah. And first web servers we were using were like Apache, and it's still around today.
We run our finance and student information system on serve it off of Apache.
Yeah. Apache, and that was before you had the ability to have your built-in Perl and built-in PHP and stuff like that. I mean, pages we started out with were just real simple. If you wanted to do anything complex, write a program, a CGI script, and run it. And we actually did learn how to do that downstairs.
You were running Perl, I'm gonna guess.
For CGIs, at first, we were actually running Shell. Apache under Unix, it doesn't matter what the program's is, as long as it's executable. So yeah, there was Shell scripts, there was Perl scripts, there was actual executables that we write up in C and compile. Pardon me. I'm sure upstairs did stuff like that too. It was interesting being there at this startup.
I don't think so.
And of course, laughing at old Vice President, what is his name? I helped build the internet.
Oh, Gore,
Yeah.
Al Gore.
Gore. You do know why he said that one, right?
Why did he say that?
He helped wire up a school district. He plugged the cables in, so he made the internet. Kind of like us, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all built the internet, I suppose.
Yeah.
When did back in those days, the ideology of computer science department was, I'll call it the ideology, was Unix and a little bit of VMS.
Mm-hmm.
When did things, or do you believe they really did, ever shift to Windows?
Well, I don't know, probably mid to late 90s that we really started doing any shifting, and we had Capener driving towards Unix, which I thought was real good, but we slowly did have the Windows picking up, but most of that was professors just wanting to be able to teach the languages on Windows because they thought that was where the newer jobs were going to be, was end user applications versus server applications. And that would have been around the time of Wolford. Wolford was one of the first ones to start pushing that. I guess that would have been mid to late 90s. I don't know.
Dave Hart was down there too.
Yeah, Hart was one of them pushing for it, and Wilford.
What about
Crittenden was kind of stepped back looking at going, I don't know, but...
Was Hilton around then? Or did he come in later?
I think he came in later.
Kent Weaver?
Kent Weaver at that time was more student than anything. I think he was doing some teaching, so he might have been helping push it. Myself, I kind of thought it was ridiculous at the time, but now looking at it, a lot of the stuff's going that way. You still do need your server apps, but there's a lot being pushed out on Windows, and myself, I feel it's not really that good idea because, let's face it, their latest release had over 2,000 documented bugs. And it's pretty bad that we've got 2,000 documented bugs and we're releasing this software. How many undocumented ones do we have already?
First time you used the internet or went out on the internet?
Yeah, no, not really. At that time, first time I would have used the internet would have been using it through UUCP, or using it through UU News. Mm-hmm. And the only thing I would have noticed would have been that we had faster response on posting. Mm-hmm. When we first started out, there was very few applications that used it. And it wasn't until over a year after we got it that we were really starting to see mm-hmm. different uses across the internet. Mm-hmm. And like I said, most of that was just gaming and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to recall, my first experience, and I think it was, of actually, actively, like interactively being on the internet, and I think it's probably something along the lines of. I got on these listservs, and that was from the internet, but that was asynchronous. You'd be reading your mail on the backs, but then it talked about that you could use something called FTP and log in anonymously. And then I figured out how to do DIR and LS and navigate around and get all this. Look at all this cool stuff they had, and even get some of it,
Yeah,
that was just thrilling, that I was, I was getting stuff from a computer in Minnesota or Pennsylvania or England or.
I think that would probably been the first interactive use I had too. Would be probably FTP or possibly TCP to somewhere and using, just like I said, an active VBS. But most likely it would have been FTP because FTP was one of the first uses we did have on it. Mm-hmm. There really wasn't too much to TCP/IP2 except for like the Library of Congress, being able to go in there mm-hmm. and reference books. So it's probably a toss-up between the two. Of FTP was most likely, but it might have been TCP going to different areas. I mean, that was, when we got hooked up, that was the big thing, was the fact that you could go somewhere and get information versus just waiting for it. Mm-hmm. Trying to think of what other things we had, like you said before, Archie, I think it was. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to think back that far because of all of the stuff that we now can do.
Yeah. I remember there was a big controversy here. A lot of earnest, important, self-important discussion in 1995, 1996, about whether the university should set up our own official Gopher server.
I know we were also looking at official news server on campus. And that, I think, didn't they actually set up one up here? Yeah. I remember vaguely that a lot of people were upset because they weren't going to carry this group or that group. Or
It was just because of space limitations. It had to be pretty drastically limited.
Well, there was that. There also was some censoring. There was a couple of groups that people were just looking at going, I mean, it's like the whole alt.6 group, of course, was cut. There was actual talk of cutting most of the alt group because of inappropriate material. And we had a lot of people down there screaming because we had alt.sources and alt.languages going, no, this ain't no. But, there was changes as we went through, and I think in a lot of ways people in the CS department were kind of upset because here we had before with our Usenet feed, we had availability to almost anything. I mean, we had tons of disk space set up just for news, and then as it went upstairs, it was like, oh, well, we don't got enough disk space, and we're going to cut this, and we're going to do this. And we're like, hold it, what happened to our saying it? So there was a little bit of contention on some of the stuff, but not as much as you would think. Most of us lab rats were just kicked back on, so we can always go somewhere else. It was the majority of the students going, well, we can't get this, we can't get that. And we're like, well, learn how to do it this way. But overall, we worked pretty darn well together. Wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
Well, apparently there was a falling out at some point, right? Or was it not all that dramatic? The difference between what was going on downstairs in computer science and...
Well,
I would say that the appearance of a falling out or not getting along was in fact a personality conflict between two individuals.
mm-hmm.
My boss from that time, Eric Jacobson, the director of academic computing, and Bob Keebner, they were absolute oil and water.
Yeah, that is true. We generally didn't, the lab rats generally didn't have a problem, because here we had this pipe to the internet, and in our own address space, we could do pretty much what we wanted. Campus-wise, these guys were taking care of the rest of campus and controlling it that way. But it wasn't until they started getting really good firewalls and stuff, and even with that, there's still a lot of stuff that you can do downstairs that other people in other areas can't do, because we pretty much have controlled machines down there. Not as much as we used to, but...
As the connections were spread out around campus, you were involved in that to some extent. They were putting bridges together and...
the actual wiring? No. Most I was active in was sitting down and saying that we had to split up the address space and figure out the best way of doing it. But the actual figuring it out of how to do it, no, I wasn't involved in that. My role was more, like I say, support. Pick my brains. Here's this information. The actual decision making was still up here.
What was the adoption rate across campus as people started getting hooked up?
Adoption rate of what?
I mean, was there one professor in one department that suddenly was hooked up to the network?
Generally, it was, from my understanding of it, we had cabling to a lot of the buildings thick wire. So it was just basically that people started having access to new things. The actual downloading of the TCP/IP stack, so a laptop could be, or a computer could be on, was rolled out pretty fast, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
So no, it wasn't just this professor getting it in this department, this professor. It was generally this department gets it. And then, okay, we'll get you onto it as soon as we can get wires ran in and get you a hub or a bridge or whatever. The main problem we had in that day was the technology curve. Because, let's face it, we had the thin wire coax type network hooked up to the thick wire through AUIs. It's not like today where you just have a phone cable going to somebody's office and you can plug into it. So there was a problem of actually running cabling out in and out of their offices and getting them hooked up that way.
Yep. Yeah. Thin wire was just error prone. You know, somebody step on a T connector and it'd bring your whole segment down.
And then you couldn't find where it was. You just knew the segment was down, and you'd have to go through and track the cable. Like I said with that professor, we're like, why isn't anything working? We thought somebody broke the connection at the beginning. Get looking, no, it's Terminator at the end. So.
And we talked a little bit about it, but how much of that hardware is still around connecting up the campus?
There's still a couple of AUI boxes, but not much. I mean, back in mid-90s, we were starting to go to Twisted Pair. I think it was about then. And I'd say late 90s, I think it was late 90s, we basically took our thick wire net and just ripped it all out. I mean, we had a wall with nothing but this thick wire cable going like this, looped down the wall with AUI connectors going to bridges, and it was late 90s. We just said, okay, last connection. That thing's just a piece of junk. Get it off the wall.
Can you recall, did that wire, did it then come up through the floor up to our area?
Yes, I think it did.
Yeah. And then it ran over to...
Either the thick wire itself went up, or we had an AUI patch cable joining the two segments.
Yeah, I can't recall. I kind of thought it actually that wire came up, but I can't quite recall.
I can't recall either. I think it was. I think we did have the thick wire joined.
You know
I know there was a couple places we jumpered it, but
the protocol is, those vampire taps have to be 2 or 3 meters apart.
Yeah.
So that's why we all had these big loops.
Yep, you had a little marker. You had a marker on the cable saying this is where you can do your closest to the last marker.
Yeah.
And we clamped down on that. Well, unfortunately, I think it's time for us to shut down.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Danny, and thanks, Ted, as well.